The dress was blue. Not the blue of the rich tapestries hanging from the walls of Ashford's great hall, nor the blue of the embroidered banners stitched in gold thread that cascaded from the ceiling almost to the polished stone floor. It was a simpler blue, an honest blue, the faded blue of fabric that had been washed too many times and loved too well. Kate had sewn it herself, working by candlelight for 3 weeks, her fingers pricked raw by the needle, her eyes aching from the strain. Every stitch had been deliberate. Every seam had been a small prayer. She stood at the entrance of the great hall and told herself she was not nervous. The hall was full. Wolves from every corner of the Northern Territories had gathered for the claiming feast, the annual gathering where alphas announced alliances, where young wolves declared their mates before the Alcataya, where promises made in private were finally spoken aloud under the eyes of the entire pack. Torches lined the stone walls in iron brackets, casting long amber shadows across the faces of lords and warriors and their women. The air smelled of burning pine resin, roasted meat, spiced wine, and beneath all of it, the deep, layered scent of wolves, fur and earth, and something old, something instinctive, something that made the back of Kate's neck prickle every time she stepped into a room full of her own kind. She was 23 years old, and she had been waiting for this night for 2 years. "You look beautiful," said a voice beside her. Sarah appeared at her elbow, slightly out of breath, her dark curls pinned unevenly, and one ribbon already coming loose from her hair. She was Kate's oldest friend, the girl who had grown up 3 cottages away in the lower village, who had held Kate's hand when her mother died and brought her soup when the grief made it impossible to cook. Sarah was also, objectively, terrible at formal occasions. She always arrived slightly late, slightly disheveled, and slightly louder than the situation required. "You're going to lose that ribbon," Kate said. "I already lost the other one." Sarah tucked her arm through Kate's and squeezed. "Are you ready?" Kate looked out at the hall. Somewhere in the crowd was Dorian. Dorian Greaves, son of the Beta of Clan Greaves, the man who had spent the last 2 years courting her in quiet, careful ways. Small gifts left at her door, walks along the forest edge at dusk, words spoken in low voices that had sounded, she had believed, like intentions. 3 days ago, he had come to her and said, "I will declare you tonight, in front of everyone. You will stand beside me at the feast." She had gone home and finished the last stitches on the blue dress. "I'm ready," she said. They moved into the hall together. Kate kept her chin level and her steps even, the way her mother had always told her to walk. Like the ground belongs to you even when it doesn't, because confidence is the only inheritance that can't be taken away. She was not high-born. She had no clan name, no rank, no alpha blood in her lineage that anyone had ever been able to trace. She was the daughter of a seamstress and a low-ranking soldier who had died in a border skirmish before she was old enough to remember his face. In a world built on bloodlines and hierarchy, Kate occupied the narrow, uncertain space between belonging and invisibility. But Dorian had seen her, or so she had believed. She found him near the central table, standing with his father and 2 older cousins, all of them dressed in the deep green of Clan Greaves. He was tall, fair-haired, broad through the shoulders, handsome in the uncomplicated way of men who had never been told they were anything less. When his eyes met hers across the room, something passed through them that she couldn't immediately name. Not warmth, not anticipation, something closer to discomfort. She smiled at him anyway. She crossed the room toward him because she had told herself she was not a coward, and the blue dress had cost her 3 weeks of candle wax and bleeding fingertips, and she was not going to waste it standing by the door. "Kate," he said her name quietly, as though testing whether it would cause damage. "Dorian." She stopped beside him. His cousins shifted almost imperceptibly, a small dismissive movement that she noticed and filed away without reacting to. "You look well. So do you." He glanced at her dress, Something flickered behind his eyes. "Listen, I need to speak with you before the declarations begin." The resin torches hissed softly. Somewhere behind her, a horn sounded, the first call, signaling that the formal portion of the feast was approaching. Around the room, conversations dropped to lower registers. Wolves began moving toward their designated places at the long tables. "Of course," Kate said. He drew her slightly to the side, into the relative shadow between a stone pillar and one of the hanging banners. His voice, when he spoke, was careful in the way of someone who had rehearsed. "My father has arranged something. An alliance with Clan Weston. Lord Weston's daughter. It's been decided. It serves the clan, and I—" He stopped, started again. "I should have told you sooner. I know that. But I didn't know how to—" "You're declaring someone else tonight," Kate said. Not a question. The words came out flat and clean, stripped of everything except their meaning, because she had suddenly discovered that she had no emotion available for this moment, or rather, that all of her emotions had arrived at once and canceled each other out, leaving behind only a strange, hollow clarity. Dorian's jaw tightened. "It's politics. You understand how this works. Clan alliances aren't made on—" "On what?" she said, very quietly. "On preference? On the things you said to me in the forest at dusk for 2 years." He said nothing. Behind her, the horn sounded again. The great hall was settling into its formal arrangement. Lords and their mates, alphas and their chosen women, everyone finding their place in the ancient hierarchy of the claiming feast. And Kate stood in the shadow of a stone pillar in a blue dress that had cost her 3 weeks of candlelight, and the quiet, stupid hope of a girl who had believed that someone had actually seen her. She did not cry. She would not cry here, in front of his cousins and his father, and the entire gathered Alcatea of the Northern Territories. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had always said that dignity was the one thing that no one could take unless you handed it to them. "I see," she said. The words were steady. She was almost surprised by how steady they were. "Then I won't keep you." She turned and walked away from him before he could say anything else, before the expression on his face, relief mixed with something that might have been guilt, or might have simply been discomfort at the inconvenience of her feelings, could settle itself permanently into her memory. She was heading for the side corridor, the one that led to the outer courtyard, where the air would be cold and clean and empty of pine resin and spiced wine, and the specific humiliation of having sewn a dress for a man who had already made different plans. She was almost to the archway when the hall changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the atmosphere, a subtle but unmistakable drop in the ambient noise, the particular quality of silence that moves through a pack when something significant has entered the room. Kate slowed despite herself. Around her, heads were turning toward the main entrance. 3 men stood at the threshold of the great hall. The one on the left was lean and dark-eyed, with a sharp smile already forming at the corner of his mouth as he surveyed the room, the kind of man who entered spaces as though he found them privately amusing. The one in the center was broader, golden-haired, with an easy confidence in his posture and a glint of something ironic in his expression, as though he had heard a joke that no one else had caught yet. And the one on the right said nothing, smiled at nothing, looked at nothing in particular, and yet was impossible not to look at. He was tall, dark-haired, with long braids pulled back from a face that was angular and composed, and entirely without performance. He wore black leather crossed with worn brown straps, a heavy fur mantle across his shoulders, bracers on his forearms. There was a thin scar along his left jaw that had long since faded to silver. His eyes, even from across the room, were the pale, particular blue of deep winter, not cold exactly, but still. The stillness of something that has been very powerful for a very long time, and no longer needs to prove it. Sarah appeared at Kate's shoulder so suddenly that Kate startled. "Kate," Sarah said in a tone that was doing its best to sound calm and failing completely. That's King Kale. The Alpha King. Kate had heard the name her entire life. Every wolf in the Northern Territories had. Kyle of Ashenmoor, the Alpha King who had united 7 warring clans under a single banner 17 years ago, who had ended the border wars with a combination of strategy and force that was still discussed in low voices at pack gatherings, who ruled from the great fortress of Ashenmoor, and rarely, almost never, came south to the territorial feasts. He was standing 20 feet away from her, and his pale, winter-still eyes had just found her face across the crowded room, and stopped. Kate became very aware that she was standing in the middle of a side corridor, in a faded blue dress, with her chin still lifted and her jaw still set from a conversation that had just dismantled 2 years of quiet hope. She looked, she imagined, like exactly what she was. A low-born woman with no clan name, walking away from a rejection at a claiming feast, caught mid-exit by the arrival of the most powerful alpha in the known territories. She held his gaze for 1 second, because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had also said that looking away first was a habit worth breaking. Then she turned and walked through the archway into the cold dark of the corridor beyond. Behind her, she heard the sharp-smiled man on the left say something in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the Alpha King's response, quiet, unhurried, and absolutely certain. Find out her name. The courtyard was empty. Kate stood in the center of it with her arms folded against the cold, her breath rising in small pale clouds into the night air. The stones beneath her feet were damp. It had rained that afternoon, and the smell of wet earth and old moss rose up from the cracks between the flagstones. Above the high walls of Ashford Keep, the sky was a deep, starless gray, heavy with the promise of more rain. The torchlight from the hall spilled through the archway behind her in a long amber rectangle that stopped just short of where she stood, as though even the light had decided she was beyond its concern. She let out a slow breath and looked down at the blue dress. 3 weeks. She had spent 3 weeks on this dress, and it had lasted exactly as long as it had taken Dorian Greaves to say the words he should have said 3 days ago, when she might have had time to feel something about them in private, in the small cottage she rented at the edge of the lower village, where no one would have seen her face. She was not going to think about that anymore. She was going to stand here in the cold until the hollowness in her chest settled into something manageable, and then she was going to go back inside and find Sarah, and eat something, because she had not eaten since that morning, and the spiced wine on an empty stomach was likely to make everything worse. She was constructing this plan with great deliberateness when footsteps crossed the archway behind her. She did not turn around. She assumed it was Sarah, who had an unerring instinct for finding Kate whenever Kate was in the process of composing herself, and would, predictably, undo all of that, composing within approximately 30 seconds. "You left quickly," said a voice that was not Sarah's. Kate turned. The man standing at the edge of the amber torchlight was the sharp-smiled one, the lean, dark-eyed man who had entered the hall on the Alpha King's left. Up close, he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with the kind of face that was always slightly tilted toward amusement, as though he were waiting for the world to say something interesting. He was dressed in dark gray with silver clasps at his shoulders, and he moved with the particular loose ease of someone who had never had cause to be uncertain of his welcome anywhere. "I had somewhere to be," Kate said, "in an empty courtyard in the rain." He glanced upward, where the first drops were indeed beginning to fall from the gray sky. "Compelling destination. Is there something I can help you with?" He studied her for a moment with those sharp, assessing eyes, not unkindly, but with the frank curiosity of someone who had been sent to gather information and was now finding the task more interesting than anticipated. "I'm Callum," he said, "third son of Lord Hadley of the Western Ridge, currently serving as the most personable member of the Alpha King's traveling party, which is a title I awarded myself, but no one has contested it. Despite everything, Something at the corner of Kate's mouth moved. She controlled it. Kate, she said. No clan name. Currently serving as the least important person at this feast, which is a title I did not award myself, but no one has contested it either. Callum's smile sharpened with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He said you didn't look away. Kate said nothing. The king, Callum clarified, as though she might have been confused about which he was in question. When he looked at you across the hall. Most people look away within about 2 seconds. Lords, alphas, warriors, doesn't matter. Something about the way he looks at things. You held it for... He tilted his head. Considerably longer. I wasn't aware there was a protocol, Kate said. There isn't. That's rather the point. He paused. He'd like to speak with you. The rain was falling more steadily now, cool and quiet against the courtyard stones. Kate felt it land on her hair, on the fabric of the blue dress, on the back of her hands where they were folded against her sides. She thought about Dorian Greaves standing at the central table in his clan green, about to declare a woman named Lord Weston's daughter, while the torchlight caught the gold thread of the banners overhead. Why? She asked. I genuinely don't know, Callum said, and I find that remarkable, because I usually know everything. He said it lightly, but there was something underneath the lightness that she thought might be honesty. He saw you from the entrance. He asked me to learn your name. I came out here to find you, and discovered you standing in the rain looking like someone who has recently decided that the entire world can manage without her opinion of it. A beat. He's not a man who makes requests without reason. I've known him for 11 years, and I can count the number of times he's expressed unprompted interest in a person on one hand. Kate looked at him steadily. I'm a seamstress's daughter with no rank and no clan, she said. I have no political value, no alliance to offer, no lineage worth noting. Whatever reason he thinks he has for wanting to speak with me, I promise you it's based on incomplete information. Possibly, Callum said, or possibly you're also working with incomplete information. He tilted his head toward the archway. Come inside. If you want to leave after 2 minutes, you can leave. The courtyard will still be here. She looked at the rain. She looked at the archway. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had come to this feast with one expectation, and it had been quietly dismantled, and that standing in a wet courtyard, in a handmade dress, was a poor way to spend the remainder of the evening. She went inside. Callum led her not back into the main hall, but through a side passage that ran along the interior wall of the keep, lit by smaller torches set into iron sconces. The stone was old here. Older than the hall, older than the feast banners, marked with the faint remnants of carvings that had been worn smooth by centuries of passing hands. Their footsteps echoed softly. Somewhere beyond the wall, Kate could hear the muffled sound of the feast beginning in earnest. Horns, voices, the percussive rhythm of a drum. The passage opened into a smaller room, a council antechamber, from the look of it, with a heavy oak table, several high-backed chairs, and a single window overlooking the inner ward. Maps and correspondence were spread across the table in organized clusters. A second torch burned in a bracket beside the door. The golden-haired man was there, the one who had stood in the center at the entrance, broad and easy in his posture. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the ironic expression still in place, and he straightened slightly when Kate entered. She came, he said, with the tone of someone settling a private bet. She came, Callum agreed. Kate, this is Brennan. He's the Alpha King's cousin and the second most personable member of the traveling party. Self-appointed ranking as well? Kate asked. Brennan's expression shifted into something that was almost a grin. His ranking is more accurate than he deserves. He looked at her with the frank, assessing look of wolves, not threatening, but direct. You were with Dorian Greaves earlier, before the declarations. Kate met his eyes without flinching. Briefly. He's declaring Weston's daughter tonight. I'm aware. Something passed between Brennan and Callum. Quick, wordless, the kind of communication that existed between men who had spent years reading each other's silences. Then the door at the far end of the antechamber opened, and the room changed. It changed the way a room changes when the weather shifts, not through any single dramatic alteration, but through a comprehensive adjustment of atmosphere, a collective, involuntary recognition that something of significant weight has just entered the space. Even Kate, who was not prone to being overwhelmed by the presence of powerful wolves, felt it move through her like a low sound felt rather than heard. Cale of Ashenmore walked into the room and stopped. He was even larger up close, not in the exaggerated, brutish way of wolves who had built their size deliberately, but in the proportioned, unhurried way of something that had grown to its natural scale and stopped apologizing for it. The fur mantle across his shoulders was black wolf pelt, old and well-maintained. The braids in his dark hair were pulled back cleanly, and the scar along his jaw caught the torchlight as he turned his head. His eyes found her immediately. That pale, winter-blue gaze was, at close range, even harder to hold than it had been across the great hall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was simply complete. The gaze of someone who looked at things and saw them entirely, without the filters of expectation or social performance. Kate held it. She had decided in the courtyard that she was done looking away from things tonight. Kate, he said. Her name, in his voice, had the quality of something being confirmed rather than introduced, as though he had already heard it and was now simply verifying that it fit. My Lord King, she said. Cale. He said it without ceremony, as a correction rather than an invitation. He moved to the table and stood at its edge, not sitting, not crowding the space, simply occupying it with the ease of a man entirely accustomed to being wherever he chose to be. You were leaving the hall. I was. Why? The directness of it caught her slightly off guard, not because it was rude, but because it was genuine. He was not making conversation. He was asking because he wanted to know. I had received some news, Kate said carefully. I needed air. Dorian Greaves. She looked at him. You know him? His father sits on the Territorial Council. A pause. Something moved behind those pale eyes. Not quite contempt, but the precise, measured assessment of someone who has formed a long-standing opinion and is choosing not to elaborate on it in present company. You were with him for 2 years. It was not a question. Kate felt a ripple of something. Not embarrassment exactly, but the specific discomfort of having private information held by someone she had met 4 minutes ago. Yes, she said. And he declared someone else tonight. Yes. Kyle looked at her. The silence lasted long enough that Callum, behind her, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Brennan had gone quite still. You didn't beg him, Cale said. No. You didn't make a scene. No. You walked away. Yes. Another silence. Then something in the set of his jaw shifted. Not a smile, not quite, but the suggestion of one. The faintest alteration in the landscape of his expression, there and gone so quickly that Kate wondered if she had imagined it. Sit down, he said. I want to speak with you about a position. Kate blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself to hear in this room, that was not among them. A position. I need a new maid for the royal chambers at Ashenmore. He said it with the same flat directness he applied to everything. My household steward will tell you the compensation is considerable. The work is straightforward. The position comes with quarters in the upper keep and full protection under the crown. A beat. I'm told you so. Kate stared at him. Across the room, Callum was examining the ceiling with great attention. Brennan appeared to be biting the inside of his cheek. "You came to a claiming feast," Kate said slowly, "to hire a maid." "I came to a claiming feast for political obligations," Cale said. "Hiring a maid was not on the agenda." He looked at her steadily. "It is now." The rain had picked up outside. Kate could hear it against the window of the antechamber, soft and persistent, washing the cobblestones of the inner ward clean. She thought about the lower village and the cottage she rented, and the 3 weeks of candlelight and the faded blue dress. She thought about her mother's voice. "The ground belongs to you even when it doesn't." "I'll need to think about it," she said. Kyle nodded once, as though this was the correct answer. "You have until morning." She said yes in the morning, not because the decision was simple. It wasn't. Sarah had spent the better part of the night sitting on the edge of Kate's borrowed cot in the guest quarters of Ashford Keep, alternating between expressions of disbelief and expressions of barely contained excitement, asking questions that Kate didn't have answers to and offering opinions that Kate hadn't requested. By the time the gray pre-dawn light began to seep through the narrow window, Sarah had cycled through shock, concern, envy, and something approaching awe, and Kate had sat with her own silence long enough to understand what was underneath it. There was nothing left for her in the lower village. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned. She had a rented cottage and a small reputation as a skilled seamstress, and a life that had been quietly organized around a future that had dissolved the night before, in the shadow of a stone pillar. She had Sarah, who was her oldest friend and her truest one, and who was also, as Kate had known for some time, being courted by a carpenter from the eastern settlement who had kind eyes and steady hands, and would, Kate suspected, make her very happy. The world was not ending. It was simply rearranging itself. "Promise me you'll send word," Sarah said, when Kate found her in the courtyard at first light to say goodbye. Her dark eyes were wet at the edges, which she was pretending was the cold wind. "Every week, even if it's just a line." "Every week," Kate promised. Sarah grabbed her by both arms and held on for a moment, fierce and brief, the way she did everything. Then she stepped back and smoothed her cloak and lifted her chin and said, "You're going to be extraordinary," in the tone of someone stating a fact. Kate picked up her traveling bundle, which contained everything she owned that was worth carrying, and walked toward the Alpha King's retinue. Ashenmore was 3 days north by road. The traveling party was larger than Kate had expected, a column of 20 riders, a supply wagon, and 4 outriders who scouted the road ahead in rotating pairs. Kate rode in the supply wagon for the first day, sitting on a folded blanket between crates of correspondence and a locked strongbox, watching the landscape change from the open fields around Ashford to the denser, older forest of the Northern Territories. The trees grew taller here, their canopies thicker, the light filtering down in long, pale columns through branches that hadn't been cleared since before anyone currently living had been born. The road was ancient stone, worn smooth by centuries of use, and the wheels of the wagon found a rhythm against it that was almost meditative. On the second day, Callum appeared beside the wagon on horseback. "You'll get a crick in your neck riding back there," he said, without preamble. "Brennan's horse is carrying light. He'll trade you for the afternoon." "I don't want to inconvenience." Brennan inconveniences himself constantly and enjoys it enormously. Callum tilted his head toward the front of the column. "Come on, the road gets more interesting up here." It did. From horseback, Kate could see the full sweep of the northern forest, the way the ancient pines crowded close to the road and then pulled back to reveal sudden clearings where the grass grew thick and silver green, where deer tracks crossed the muddy edges of small streams, where the occasional ruins of old stone structures stood half consumed by moss and climbing ivy. She had never been this far north. The air was different here, sharper, cleaner, carrying underneath the pine and the damp earth a faint mineral cold that she had never encountered before, as though the stone itself were exhaling. Callum rode beside her and talked, which she was beginning to understand was simply what Callum did. He talked about the territories, about the history of the northern clans, about the 7-year consolidation that had ended the border wars. He talked in the way of someone who has a great deal of information and a genuine enthusiasm for dispensing it, and Kate listened because the information was useful, and also because Callum, beneath the sharpness and the perpetual amusement, was unexpectedly kind. "Tell me about Ashenmore," she said, during a lull. "Large," Callum said. "Older than anything in the south by about 4 centuries. The outer walls are original. You can still see the markings of the first pack carved into the foundation stones if you know where to look. The inner keep is where the royal chambers are, and that's where you'll be working. There's also the great library, the armory, the training yard, the pack hall." He paused. "And the young prince's quarters." Kate looked at him. "The king has a child?" "A son. Caden." Something shifted in Callum's expression, not darkening exactly, but becoming more careful. "He's 9 years old. His mother? Queen Seraphine died 4 years ago. A fever in the winter." A pause. "It was difficult. For everyone." Another pause, during which Kate understood that difficult was doing considerable work as a word. Caden, Callum finished, in a tone that conveyed a great deal without specifying any of it. Kate filed this information away carefully. On the 3rd afternoon, Ashenmore appeared on the horizon. It rose from the tree line like something that had grown there rather than been built, a mass of dark stone towers and high walls that caught the late light and held it, amber and gray in deep shadow, against the backdrop of the pine forest that surrounded it on 3 sides. The banner of the Alpha King flew from the highest tower, black field, silver wolf, no other ornamentation. Simple. Absolute. Kate looked at it for a long moment from the road below. Then the gates opened, and they rode in. The royal chambers occupied the entire eastern wing of the inner keep. The household steward, a precise and efficient woman named Maid, who wore her gray hair in a severe knot and communicated approval through the graduated absence of disapproval, gave Kate a tour that lasted 2 hours and covered every room, corridor, storage alcove, and protocol she would need to know. The compensation was, as Callum had indicated, considerable. The quarters assigned to Kate were small, but clean. A stone room on the upper floor with a narrow bed, a writing desk, a window that looked out over the inner ward, and a small iron brazier that, Marit informed her, drew well in all weather. "The king rises before dawn," Marit said, in the tone of someone delivering a critical military briefing. "He takes his morning meal in the study, not the hall. He does not require assistance dressing. He has never required assistance dressing, and he finds the offer irritating. He will not ask for things twice. If something needs doing, it should be done before he notices it needs doing." A pause. "He is not difficult as lords go. He is simply precise." "And the prince?" Kate asked. Marit's expression did something complicated. "Prince Caden," she said carefully, "has particular requirements." Kate waited. "He is 9 years old and has lost his mother," Marit said, with the deliberate precision of someone choosing words from a narrow and carefully considered selection. "He is also the son of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and he is aware of both of these facts, and he has reached certain conclusions about them that are not always constructive." She looked at Kate directly. "Every Luna who has entered this keep in the past 4 years has left within 3 months. The last 2 left within 3 weeks." Kate said nothing. "He is not a cruel child," Marit said, and something in her voice made Kate think that she meant this sincerely, that she had known Caden since before the fever took his mother, and she was still, in some deep and stubborn place, defending him. "He is a grieving child, who has learned that if he makes enough people leave, he doesn't have to feel the particular pain of having them stay and then go anyway. She looked at Kate for a long moment. You are not a Luna. You are a maid. Whether that changes his approach, I cannot tell you. Kate thought about this. What does he do? Merritt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He has been known to be physically disruptive. He took a painting from the wall of the upper corridor and threw it into the courtyard. He has damaged furniture. He has, on 3 separate occasions, been physically confrontational with members of the household staff. A pause. And the women the king has received socially, the Lunas who have come to Ashen Moor at the recommendation of the council, who have tried to establish rapport with him. He has made their time here quite difficult. Kate looked out the window of the corridor at the inner ward below. In the fading afternoon light, she could see the training yard, empty now, the wooden practice posts worn smooth with use. Beyond it, the gates. Beyond the gates, the forest. Is the king aware? She asked. The king, Marit said, with the careful neutrality of someone walking a very precise line, loves his son, and is managing a grief of his own that he does not discuss. She straightened. I tell you this not to discourage you. I tell you so that you are not surprised. Kate nodded slowly. She met Prince Caden the following morning. She was carrying a tray of correspondence from the steward's office to the king's study when she turned a corner in the upper corridor and found a boy standing in the middle of the hallway, directly in her path. He was small for 9, dark-haired like his father, with his father's angular jaw still soft with childhood. He was wearing a rumpled tunic and no shoes, and he was looking at her with pale blue eyes, his father's eyes, exactly his father's eyes, with an expression of deliberate, performative hostility that Kate recognized immediately as the expression of a child who had decided in advance how this interaction was going to go. He said nothing. He simply stood there, in the center of the corridor, and stared at her. Kate stopped. She looked at the tray in her hands. She looked at the boy. She looked at the narrow width of the corridor and calculated that she could not pass without either asking him to move or stepping around him in a way that would require acknowledging the deliberateness of his positioning. Good morning, she said. He said nothing. I'm Kate. I'm new. She nodded toward the study door at the end of the corridor. I need to get past you. His chin lifted, his jaw set. These were his father's gestures, transplanted into a 9-year-old face, and under different circumstances, Kate might have found it almost painfully endearing. I don't want you here, Caden said. His voice was flat and certain in the way of children who have decided that the flat certainty of adults is a language worth learning. The others left. You'll leave too. Kate looked at him for a moment. Then she adjusted the tray in her hands, stepped to the left, and walked past him in the space between him and the wall, not squeezing, not rushing, not acknowledging in any way that he had positioned himself as an obstacle. Probably, she said as she passed, but not today. She felt his eyes on her back all the way to the study door. Inside, Cale was standing at the table over a spread of maps, exactly as she had imagined him. Still, precise, present in the particular concentrated way of a man whose attention, when directed at something, was directed entirely. He looked up when she entered. She set the tray on the corner of the table where Marit had indicated correspondence was to be placed. She turned to go. You met Caden, Kyle said. It wasn't a question. Kate paused at the door. In the corridor, she said. Yes. A silence. She turned back slightly, enough to see his face. Something was there that she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability exactly, but the edge of it. A place where the precision and the stillness had worn thin in one specific spot. He told you to leave, Cal said. Yes. What did you say? Kate considered. I said probably, but not today. Kyle looked at her. That winter blue gaze held hers for a moment that lasted, she thought, slightly longer than necessary. Then he looked back down at his maps. "Good," he said quietly. Kate walked back into the corridor. The boy was gone. But at the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the shadow where the torchlight didn't quite reach, she caught the faint sound of small feet on stone, moving quickly away. 3 weeks passed. Caden did not make it easy. On the 4th day, he knocked a pitcher of water from a shelf as Kate passed through the upper corridor. A deliberate, unhurried motion. His eyes on her face the entire time, watching for the flinch. She looked at the water spreading across the stone floor. She looked at him. She went to find a cloth, came back, and cleaned it up without a word. He watched her the entire time from the doorway, and when she was done, she stood up and said, "You're going to have to try harder than that," in the same tone she would use to comment on the weather. He didn't speak to her for 2 days after that, but he stopped leaving his room quite as far in advance of her morning rounds, and once, she was nearly certain, she saw the edge of a dark head pull back behind a doorframe as she came up the stairs. On the 9th day, she found a small stone on the writing desk in her quarters. Gray, smooth, the size of a thumb, with a faint natural stripe of white quartz running through it. She didn't know how it had gotten there. She put it on the windowsill and said nothing about it to anyone. On the 14th day, Caden came into the king's study while Kate was organizing the shelves of rolled correspondence along the east wall and said, without greeting or preamble, "My mother used to sing when she worked." Kate continued organizing the shelves. "What did she sing?" A long pause. "Old songs, pack songs, the ones about the forest." "Do you remember them?" Another pause. Longer. "Some of them." Kate straightened a roll of correspondence and moved to the next shelf. "You could teach me one sometime," she said, "if you wanted." She didn't look at him. She had learned in 14 days that Caden approached things the way wild animals approached unfamiliar objects. Sideways, without direct acknowledgement, requiring the pretense that nothing significant was happening in order for anything significant to happen at all. He didn't respond. But he stayed in the study for another half hour, sitting on the window seat with a book he wasn't reading. And when he left, he took the book with him instead of dropping it on the floor, which was progress of a kind. Kyle noticed. Kate became aware of this gradually, not through anything he said directly, because Kyle did not say things directly unless he had decided they needed to be said, but through a series of small observations. He began timing his arrival to the study differently, appearing in the doorway just as she was finishing the morning correspondence, lingering a moment longer than necessary before settling at the table. He began leaving the inner door to the study unlatched, which Marit told her he had never done before. Once, returning from the library with a stack of reference volumes, Kate found him standing at the corridor window looking out at the inner ward, and when she passed, he turned and watched her go with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Intent and quiet, and complicated in ways she didn't have enough information to interpret. She did not allow herself to think too carefully about any of this. She was a maid. He was the Alpha King. These were facts, and she had always been practical about facts. And the last time she had constructed an emotional architecture around a man who had never actually confirmed he intended to inhabit it, she had ended up standing in the rain in a courtyard in a blue dress at a claiming feast. She was not inclined to repeat the experience. But she was human. Or wolf, rather. And she noticed things she would have preferred not to notice. The way he moved through rooms with a controlled, deliberate economy that was somehow more striking than men who moved loudly. The way he listened, completely, without the restless impatience of men who are waiting for their turn to speak. The thin silver scar along his jaw that she found herself looking at in unguarded moments, wondering about the story attached to it. The way, occasionally, when Callum said something particularly absurd, The corner of his mouth would shift in that almost smile that came and went too quickly to be certain of. She was not constructing anything. She was simply observing. These were entirely different activities, and she was very firm about the distinction. On the 18th day, the council visitors arrived. There were 4 of them, lords from southern clans, members of the territorial council that governed the formal politics of the northern territories, under the Alpha King's authority. They came with their retinues, and their agendas, and their daughters, because 2 of them had daughters of appropriate age, and the appropriate understanding that proximity to the Alpha King's table was a form of currency, and that a widowed king with a 9-year-old heir was, from a political standpoint, a situation that required management. Kate learned all of this from Callum, who delivered information the way some people delivered weather reports. Comprehensive, regular, and without apparent judgment. The daughters' names were Isolde and Mira. They were both beautiful in the polished, deliberate way of women raised to be beautiful as a strategic asset. They arrived with trunks of clothing and personal attendants, and the practiced ease of people who had been trained since childhood to navigate rooms of powerful wolves. They were installed in the guest quarters of the upper keep, and at dinner that first evening they sat at the high table on either side of the Alpha King's chair with the coordinated precision of a planned campaign. Kate served at the edges of the hall that evening, carrying wine and bread, moving along the periphery of the room with the trained invisibility of household staff. She watched without appearing to watch. Isolde was graceful and spoke beautifully, her voice pitched to carry exactly as far as she intended. Mira was warmer, with an easy laugh and expressive hands, and she leaned toward Cale with the natural ease of someone accustomed to being leaned toward. Both of them were accomplished and well-bred and entirely appropriate, and Kate observed all of this with a neutrality that she told herself was genuine and did not examine too closely. Cale was courteous. He was not cold. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He was everything a king at his own table ought to be. But Kate, who had spent 18 days studying the precise gradations of his expression, could see that the quality of his attention at that table was different from the quality of his attention in the study over his maps. He was present in the way that he was always present. He was not interested in the way he was sometimes, unexpectedly, interested. She told herself this observation was irrelevant, and moved on to refilling wine at the lower tables. It was Caden who created the incident. He was seated at the far end of the high table, which was where he sat at formal dinners, visible enough to satisfy protocol, far enough from the center to minimize the damage potential, which Merritt managed with the quiet efficiency of long practice. He had been quiet through the first 2 courses, which Kate had noted and been cautiously relieved by. Then Mira, in the warm, inclusive way she had, leaned across the table toward him and said something. Kate couldn't hear what, exactly. But the tone was the tone of an adult attempting cheerful engagement with a child at a formal dinner. Caden looked at her. His pale blue eyes were flat and cold in the way they got when he had decided something. He picked up his goblet of water, looked at her steadily, and poured it deliberately across the tablecloth in her direction. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Mira pushed back from the table. Her attendant appeared. 2 of the council lords shifted in their chairs with the particular stiffness of men recalibrating the evening's political calculations. Isolde's expression went carefully neutral. Cale set down his fork. His face was composed and entirely still, but Kate, watching from across the room, could see the muscle in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Not anger exactly, but the very particular tension of a man absorbing something painful in public. He began to rise. Kate was already moving. She reached the high table before Cale had fully stood, carrying a folded linen cloth from the serving station, and she laid it across the spilled water with calm efficiency, absorbing the spread before it could reach Mira's gown. She straightened. She looked at Caden. He was watching her. His chin was up, his jaw set. That gesture again, his father's gesture transposed. and beneath the defiance there was something raw and frightened that he was doing everything in his power to hide. "My Lord Prince," Kate said quietly, "will you walk with me to the kitchen? I believe cook set aside the almond tarts for after the main course, and I could use a hand carrying them." The entire high table was very still. Caden stared at her. She could see him weighing it, the escape route she was offering against the pride that would insist he didn't need one. She held his gaze and kept her face calm, and she did not look at Cale, though she was intensely aware of him standing 3 feet away. After a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have, Caden pushed back his chair and stood up. "Fine," he said, with the aggressive indifference of a child accepting a kindness he isn't ready to acknowledge. Kate nodded to the table and led him out through the side door. In the corridor beyond, Caden walked beside her in silence for a long moment. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his formal tunic, his shoulders up around his ears. "I don't like her," he said finally. "You don't know her," Kate said. "She smiled at me like I was something to manage." Kate considered this. She thought about the precision of Mira's social grace, the way it had a quality of calculation underneath the warmth. She thought about being seen through rather than being seen. "That," she said carefully, "is a very perceptive observation. You still can't pour water on people." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly. "My father's going to be angry." "Yes," Kate said. "He is." "Are you going to tell him I—" He stopped. "That you were frightened?" Kate said gently. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He was staring at the stone floor, and the defiance had gone out of his shoulders entirely, leaving behind something much younger and much more honest. "I don't want anyone else here," he said. His voice was very small. "Everyone who comes here, they look at my father like he's something they want, and they look at me like I'm something they have to." He swallowed. "My mother looked at me like I was the whole point." The corridor was very quiet. Kate stood still and let the words settle. "I know," she said. "I know she did." He looked up at her. His pale eyes were wet at the edges, and he was fighting it with the fierce, exhausting dignity of a 9-year-old who had decided that crying was not something he was allowed to do anymore. Kate crouched down so she was at his level. "Your mother is not replaceable," she said. "No one who comes here is going to replace her, and anyone who looks at you like you're something to manage rather than someone to know, those are not the right people." She held his gaze. "But Caden, you can't keep doing this. Not because of the mess or the dinners or the politics, but because one day you're going to pour water on someone and feel terrible about it and have no way to take it back. And that feeling is much worse than whatever you were trying to prevent." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth, gray stone, identical to the one that had appeared on her windowsill 10 days ago. "I found it in the training yard," he said gruffly, holding it out. "It has a white line through it. I thought—" He stopped, shrugged with enormous, unconvincing casualness. "You can have it if you want." Kate took the stone. It was warm from his pocket. "Thank you," she said. When they returned to the corridor outside the great hall, Kyle was waiting. He looked at his son for a long moment, that complete, absolute gaze, and something passed between them in the silence that Kate didn't have words for. Then Cale placed one large hand briefly on the top of Caden's head, a single gesture of acknowledgement that was not forgiveness and not anger, but something more complicated and more true than either. Then his eyes moved to Kate. She was still holding the stone. He looked at it. He looked at her. That muscle in his jaw moved again, but differently this time. Not tension. Something quieter. "Come to the study tomorrow morning," he said. before the council meeting. "Yes, my lord," Kate said. He turned and walked back into the hall, and Kate stood in the corridor with a small gray stone in her hand and the absolute certainty that she was, despite every reasonable precaution she had taken, in a great deal of trouble. She was at the study door before dawn. The keep was quiet at that hour. The deep, particular quiet of a large stone building before the household woke, when the only sounds were the distant shift of the night watch on the outer walls and the soft settling of the braziers burning low in the corridors. Kate had not slept well. She had lain on her narrow bed watching the gray square of her window lighten by degrees and thinking about the stone on her windowsill. There were two of them now, side by side, and about Caden's voice in the corridor saying my mother looked at me like I was the whole point, and about the way Cale had looked at her when she was holding the stone, and about all the reasonable precautions she had taken, and how thoroughly useless they appeared to be proving. She knocked. "Come in." He was already at the table. The maps from the previous days had been replaced by a single document, a formal council record, she could see from the seal, the kind produced for official territorial proceedings. He was standing with his hands braced on the table's edge, reading, and he looked up when she entered with that immediate, complete attention that she had stopped being surprised by and started being undone by, which was a development she was not pleased about. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across the table from him, the one she had started to think of as hers, which was another development she was cataloging with concern. Kyle straightened. He looked at the document for a moment, then pushed it aside and looked at her directly. "The council," he said, "has been petitioning me for 2 years to take a new mate, a political alliance through a formal claiming. They have provided at various intervals a list of recommended candidates." A pause. "Isolde and Mira are the latest iteration of that list." Kate said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was keeping her face very still. "I have declined every recommendation for 2 years," Kyle continued, with the same flat directness he brought to everything. "Not out of grief alone, though that has been part of it, but because every candidate on every list has been selected for political utility. And political utility is not a sufficient foundation for what I would be asking of someone." He paused again. Something moved in his expression, something that required, she thought, some effort to allow. Caden needs a mother, not a political appointment. Someone who looks at him and sees him. His jaw tightened slightly. "You saw him last night." "He's not difficult," Kate said quietly. "He's devastated." "Yes." The word was very simple and very heavy. "Yes, he is." He looked at the window for a moment, at the gray pre-dawn light gathering beyond the glass. "He has not accepted a single person I have brought into this keep. He has driven away every Luna the council has recommended with a thoroughness that would be impressive if it weren't so painful." A pause. Last night was the first time in 4 years that he allowed someone to walk him out of a room without it becoming a crisis. Kate looked at her hands. "I am not asking you to be his mother," Cale said. "I am not asking you to fill a space that belongs to someone else. Seraphine she was extraordinary, and Caden knows that, and I would not insult either of them by pretending otherwise." He moved from behind the table, not toward her, just away from it, to the window, where he stood with his back to the glass and his arms at his sides. "I am asking you something different. Something that I recognize has no reasonable precedent in the politics of this territory and will require considerable patience from everyone involved." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking if you are willing to stay, not as a maid. As something that doesn't have a clean political title yet, and may not for some time, because the council will have opinions, and the territory will have opinions, and working through those opinions will take longer than I would like." The keep was still very quiet. Somewhere in the corridor outside, the first sounds of the household beginning to wake, distant footsteps, the creak of a door. "You're asking me to court you," Kate said. The directness of the words surprised even her. Something in Cale's expression shifted. That not quite smile, the one that came and went too quickly, but this time it stayed a fraction of a second longer. "I am asking you to allow me to court you," he said, "which is a different thing. You are not obligated to any outcome." Kate looked at him. She thought about the lower village and the rented cottage and the blue dress, and Dorian Greaves saying its politics in the shadow of a stone pillar. She thought about Sarah saying, "You're going to be extraordinary," in the gray morning light of the courtyard. She thought about Caden's voice. "She looked at me like I was the whole point." And about two smooth gray stones sitting side by side on her windowsill. She thought about the first morning she had walked into this study and set a tray of correspondence on the corner of this table and turned to leave. And Cale had said, "You met Caden," and she had heard, underneath the words, the precise sound of a man carrying something very heavy for a very long time, with no one to help him with it. "The council won't accept it easily," she said. "No," Cale agreed. "They won't. I have no rank, no clan name, no political value." "You have," Cale said quietly, "exactly the qualities that cannot be manufactured through rank or clan or political calculation, and that I have apparently been unable to find through 2 years of council recommendations." He held her gaze. "That is a form of value I find considerably more relevant." Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something you should know." He waited. "The night at Ashford, before Callum found me in the courtyard." She looked at the table. "I wasn't only getting air. I was—" She stopped. Chose honesty the way she always chose it, plain and without ornament. "I was deciding whether I believed that anything I had to offer was worth offering to anyone. 2 years is a long time to be seen, and then discover you weren't. And it does something to the way you calculate your own worth." She looked up at him. "I'm telling you this not because I want your sympathy. I'm telling you because you should know that the woman you're asking this of has recently had to rebuild some foundational beliefs about herself, and that process is not entirely complete, and courtship under those conditions may be uneven." Kyle looked at her for a long moment. The winter blue of his eyes in the early morning light was different from how it looked by torchlight. Warmer, somehow. Or perhaps she was simply learning to read it better. "I know what it is to rebuild after loss," he said. "I am not asking for someone finished. I am asking for someone true." The first full light of dawn came through the window and lay across the table between them, pale gold against the old oak. "All right," Kate said. "Yes." The council did not accept it easily. Lord Hadley, Callum's father, as it happened, which Callum bore with the particular long-suffering of someone whose family consistently generated his professional complications, was the most vocal. He came to the formal council session that afternoon with a prepared argument and the expressions of 2 other lords who had coordinated their opposition overnight, and he delivered it with the polished efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 30 years. Kate was not present for the session. She was in the upper corridor with Caden, who had appeared at her door that morning with the aggressive casualness of someone who had decided something, and was not going to acknowledge having decided it, and suggested, in a tone of complete indifference, that she might want to see the old pack markings carved into the foundation stones of the East Tower, since apparently no one had told her about them yet. They spent the morning in the East Tower. Caden showed her the carvings, ancient symbols worn smooth but still legible if you knew what you were looking for. The marks of the 7 original clans pressed into the stone before the consolidation, before the wars, before Cale had bound them together under a single banner. He traced them with his fingers and told her their names in the old pack language, and Kate listened and asked questions and understood, without needing it stated, that this was Caden giving her something, a piece of the history that was his, the history he had inherited, the history his mother had known. When they came back down to the inner ward, Callum was waiting at the base of the tower stairs with the expression of mild triumph. "The council has registered their formal objection," he said, "which means it has been heard, recorded and set aside. Lord Hadley made 3 excellent points that the king acknowledged and then overruled. Brennan and I have drafted a statement for the territorial record that is both diplomatically sound and quietly devastating to the opposition's position, if I do say so." He paused. "The Alpha King does not require the council's permission to make personal decisions. He requires only that objections be formally heard. They have been." Another pause. "Isolde and Mira departed this morning. They were gracious about it. Mira, I think, was genuinely relieved." Caden, standing beside Kate, looked up at Callum with his father's steady gaze. "Is Kate staying?" he asked, with the flat directness of someone who has decided that the flat certainty of adults is still a language worth using. "Yes," Callum said. "She is." Caden nodded once. He put his hands in his pockets. He walked back toward the inner keep with the exaggerated casualness of someone who is very pleased and absolutely refusing to show it. Callum watched him go. "Progress," he said. Winter came to Ashen Moor in the way it always came to the north. Not suddenly, but with a slow, deliberate accumulation. The cold deepening by degrees, the forest darkening, the first snows arriving in the night and lying still and white across the courtyard stones in the morning. Kate learned the rhythms of the keep. She learned which corridors caught the draft from the east, and which were warm all day from the kitchens below. She learned that Kyle read until very late, and that the light under his study door was the last light to go out in the upper keep each night. She learned that Marit's disapproval was a sliding scale with a surprisingly high ceiling, and that reaching the ceiling was, in its way, a form of acceptance. She learned that Brennan was quietly, surprisingly thoughtful under the easy manner, and that Callum's perpetual amusement was the particular defense mechanism of someone who cared deeply and found it easier to be sharp than to be soft. She learned Caden. He taught her 3 of the old pack songs. She sang them badly, and he corrected her with the merciless precision of a 9-year-old who had inherited his father's exacting standards, and these were the best conversations they had. He showed her the library, the great library, the one that Callum had mentioned on the road. 4 stories of shelved volumes and rolled manuscripts that smelled of old leather and dust, and the particular preserved cold of stone walls. He had a favorite corner, 3rd floor, north window, where the light came in at an angle in the late afternoon that was, he informed her gravely, the best light in the keep for reading. She began to bring her mending there in the afternoons, and he began to bring his books, and they sat in the best light in the keep together without always speaking, which was its own kind of language. Cale courted her the way he did everything, deliberately, without performance. He brought her things he thought she would find interesting. A manuscript from the library on the history of the original pack markings, a piece of carved stone from the East Tower foundation that had come loose in the autumn repair work. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with that complete, unhurried attention that she had stopped being undone by and started simply receiving, which felt like the end of a very long distance and the beginning of something else entirely. He told her about Seraphine one evening in the study, the fire low and the snow falling outside the window. Not a long account, not an unburdening, but a handful of true things said quietly to someone he had decided deserved to know them. Seraphine had been fierce and funny, and she had loved the forest in the rain. She had sung the old pack songs to Caden every night until the fever took her voice. And then she had hummed them, and Caden had learned every word. She had told Cale, in the last weeks, not to be alone forever, and he had promised her he would try, and the promise had cost him more than he had anticipated. Kate listened and said nothing until he was finished. Then she said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving." Cale was quiet for a moment. "She was," he said. And something in the set of his shoulders changed, not collapsed, but released. the way a held breath is finally let go. The formal declaration came at the winter solstice gathering. Every clan of the Northern Territories sent representatives, lords and warriors and their families, gathered in the great hall of Ashenmoor under the silver wolf banner, the torches burning bright against the deep midwinter dark. It was the largest gathering the keep had seen in years, and the hall was loud with it. Voices and laughter and the complex, layered scent of wolves from 7 clans. Old alliances and older histories all present in the same stone room. Kate stood in the hall in a new dress. It was deep green, the color of the northern pines in winter, and she had sewn it herself over the past 3 weeks by candlelight in her room, her fingers careful and deliberate with every stitch. Marit had found her the fabric. Good wool, dense and warm, and had presented it with the complete absence of ceremony that was her version of great affection. Caden had found her in the corridor that morning and examined the dress with the critical eye of someone who had opinions. "It's good," he had said, which from Caden was the equivalent of an ovation. When Cale walked into the hall, he found her immediately across the room. He crossed to her without stopping to speak to anyone else first, which Callum later informed her had been noted by every political observer present and had communicated, with complete efficiency, everything that needed communicating before a single word was spoken. He stood before her. The hall had gone to one of its listening silences. "Kate," he said. Her name, in his voice, still had the quality of something confirmed. "Cale," she said. He reached into the breast of his leather coat and drew out a length of braided cord, black and silver, the colors of Ashenmoor. The claiming cord, the oldest symbol in pack tradition, the one that predated all the formal political machinery of councils and territorial records and alliance negotiations. Simple and absolute. He held it between them. "Before this Alcatia," he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the stone hall, and before every clan of the Northern Territories. By my own choice, without council mandate or political calculation. He looked at her steadily. "Kate, will you stand beside me?" Kate looked at the cord. She looked at his face, the angular jaw, the silver scar, the winter blue eyes that saw things entirely and without pretense. She thought about everything that had led to this room. A blue dress in a stone pillar, and a courtyard in the rain, and a 3-day road through ancient pines, and a 9-year-old boy with his hands in his pockets, who had given her smooth gray stones from the training yard. She thought about her mother's voice. "The ground belongs to you even when it doesn't." She reached out and took the cord. "Yes," she said. The hall was very still for a moment. Then Callum started something that was probably supposed to be restrained acknowledgement, and became, within approximately 3 seconds, entirely undignified, and Brennan was laughing, and the assembled representatives of 7 clans of the Northern Territories were rising from their seats, and somewhere in the back of the hall, a small dark-haired boy in a formal tunic was standing on a bench to see over the crowd, his pale eyes bright, his chin lifted, looking, for the first time in 4 years, like someone who had just been given something back. Dorian Greaves was there. He had come as part of the Greaves clan delegation, and he stood near the back of the hall with the particular expression of a man who has recently understood the precise weight of a decision he made 6 months ago. Kate saw him once across the room and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. Just the clean, completed absence of something that had once mattered and had been made irrelevant by time and by better things. She looked away from him and did not look back. They were mated in the first thaw of spring, when the snow pulled back from the courtyard stones and the forest beyond the walls turned from black and white to the tentative green of new growth. The ceremony was held in the inner ward under an open sky, and every clan of the Northern Territories sent witness. Caden stood beside his father in his best tunic and held the ceremonial cord with both hands, and the fierce, careful dignity of someone performing an important duty. And when it was done, He looked up at Kate with his father's eyes and said nothing. But he reached out and took her hand and held it. And that was everything. Marit declared the whole affair adequately executed, which Callum translated for Kate as the highest praise the woman was physiologically capable of producing. In the months that followed, Ashenmore settled into itself differently, not without difficulty, not without the ongoing management of territorial politics and council negotiations and the ordinary complications of a life lived at scale, but with a quality of inhabitation it had been missing. The library's third-floor north window remained the best light in the keep for reading. The old pack songs were sung in the evenings sometimes, imperfectly, with correction provided at high volume by a 10-year-old who had inherited his father's standards and his mother's memory. The two smooth gray stones sat on the windowsill of a room that was no longer the maid's quarters, but was still, in some important way, Kate's own. The place she came back to when she needed the particular silence of a space that belonged to her. Cale came to find her there one evening in late autumn, the second autumn, and stood in the doorway with the quiet ease of a man entirely at home in a place he had not always been at home in, and looked at the two stones on the windowsill. "He gave you those," he said. "The first one appeared on my desk on the 9th day," Kate said. "I never asked him about it." Cale was quiet for a moment. "He used to leave stones on his mother's windowsill," he said. "When he found ones with white lines through them, she collected them." He paused. "He stopped after she died. I didn't know he had started again." Kate looked at the two stones in the fading light, gray and smooth and ordinary and entirely irreplaceable. "I know," she said softly. Cale crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out together at the inner ward, where the last autumn light was going gold across the stones, and Caden was in the training yard below, practicing his footwork with the focused, tireless energy of a boy who had decided that life was worth the effort of full participation in it. Outside, the forest darkened toward evening. The silver wolf banner moved slowly against the sky. Somewhere in the keep below, Callum was saying something that made Brennan laugh, and the sound of it rose through the stone floors and the old walls and filled the quiet of the room like warmth. Kate leaned her shoulder against Cale's arm. He did not move away. The story had found its ending, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small true things. Two stones on a windowsill, a boy singing old songs in a library, a king who had learned to let his study door stay unlatched, and a woman who had walked away from a courtyard in the rain, and in doing so, had walked toward everything that actually mattered. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was whole.